Congress should revisit this, because if we continue to expand Rule 41 in this way and authorize more and more nationwide hacking warrants, we may end up in a place that we don't like, because we'll be giving the government broad power to search any digital device anywhere in the country if it says that the code is illegal.
I'm Matt Gluck, research fellow at Lawfare, and this is the Lawfare podcast, March 19th, 2024. Last May, Microsoft announced that a Chinese state-sponsored hacking group, Typhoon, appeared to be targeting U.S. critical infrastructure and entities abroad, in part through establishing a presence in a malware-infected network, or botnet, consisting of old devices located in the United States. At the end of January, the Justice Department announced it had removed the botnet from hundreds of American devices. Cybersecurity experts Timothy Edgar and Paul Rosenzweig both wrote articles for Lawfare discussing the Typhoon intrusion and the U.S. response. But the authors take away very different lessons from the intrusion. Edgar argued that although the removal of the botnet was a success in terms of cybersecurity, the legal theory the government relied on for conducting this operation has dangerous privacy implications. Rosenzweig, on the other hand, contended that the Typhoon breach illuminates flawed assumptions at the core of the U.S. cybersecurity strategy, which he says must be re-examined. We discussed why the Typhoon intrusion and the U.S. response that followed matter for the future of U.S. cybersecurity and privacy, how the government should weigh security and privacy when responding to cyber intrusions, whether nuclear conflict is a good analogy for cyber conflict, and much more. It's the Lawfare podcast, March 19th, Timothy Edgar and Paul Rosenzweig on the Typhoon cyber intrusion. Tim, Paul, you recently both wrote excellent pieces on Lawfare, analyzing the lessons the national security community should learn from the recent Typhoon cyber intrusion. Paul, to get us started, what is Typhoon and why are we talking about the group?
Well, Typhoon is the code name that America has given to a rather significant cyber intrusion that was recently publicly disclosed by U.S. federal agencies. The intrusion itself is attributed by American agencies to Chinese state-sponsored actors. And I should add, when I say U.S. agencies, that's really incomplete because the warning was joined in by the cybersecurity agencies of some of our closest allies from the UK, or Australia, New Zealand, Canada. The intrusion itself is said to be resident in and targeted at American critical infrastructure. Think water treatment facilities, the electric grid, that sort of thing. And what makes this intrusion different from others that we've seen before is two things. The first is that our intelligence community assesses that the Typhoon choice of targets and patterns of behavior make it more than traditional cyber espionage or intelligence gathering activities. Rather, American agencies assess that Typhoon actors, that is the Chinese, were positioning themselves on IT networks so that they could later move laterally within those networks to operational technology and disrupt those functions. In other words, they assess that the Chinese were planning to move laterally within, say, the electric grid and actually make efforts to disrupt the delivery of electricity to American consumers at a time of geopolitical tension. So in plainest language, what they thought was the Chinese were getting ready to try and shut off parts of the electric grid or the wastewater treatment facilities or communication systems if we ever came to military blows with the Chinese over Taiwan. The other really significant difference between this intrusion and others was that in order to intrude upon the larger critical infrastructure systems in the United States, the Chinese used a method that colloquially called living off the land, where they infected swaths of vulnerable digital devices like routers and modems and internet-connected security cameras that were not maintained and operated by the infrastructure providers themselves, but rather were being operated by small-scale providers, you and me and Tim and small businesses. And it used those smaller devices as jumping off points or way stations to getting to the larger infrastructure that they were ultimately targeting. The fact that they used all these small devices was not a change of tactics, but the extent to which they did so was, again, a kind of step function differentiation of prior activity. And it has caused a lot of interesting legal and practical problems in how to respond to the Chinese intrusion.
So, Tim, how does this recent Volt Typhoon intrusion square with other cyber breaches the U.S. government has dealt with for quite a while now, like Core Flood and the Fancy Bear operation?
Sure. So I think this is, first of all, it's using a botnet, and that's something that has been used by hackers for a long time for lots of different purposes. A botnet is basically a huge network of connected devices that have been all enslaved together into an infected network and then are under the control of a bot herder. And they've been used in the past for spam, to deliver malware, including ransomware. They've also been used to cover the tracks of hackers so that attacks or other kinds of intrusions appear to be coming from somewhere other than the attackers themselves. Probably the most common use we've thought of in terms of botnets has been DDoS attacks, distributed denial of service attacks, where you launch attacks to shut down websites or other internet resources with a flood of traffic. So they're versatile and they can be used for all sorts of different purposes. So that's not really new. What I write about in my piece is the way the government used a new kind, what I call a nationwide mass hacking warrant, a new kind of search warrant that allows them to essentially take over the botnet from the hackers, become a bot herder themselves, and then order the botnet to delete itself. This is similar to a couple of other examples that they've used, but this is pretty new. The first time we saw an operation where the government actually crossed the Rubicon of going inside innocent people's devices, Americans' devices like Paul or me or you or others, for a good purpose, for a very good purpose, and to delete malware, to disconnect your device from a botnet you didn't even know it was connected to, but still doing it secretly without your consent, going into your device. First time that it's really done that in this way was in 2021. So that's pretty new. Core Flood, which was more than a decade earlier, 2011, was done entirely in a voluntary way. They know where the devices are infected, the government does, and then they can work with the ISPs, and the ISPs know that your device is connected to their network. In the Core Flood mitigation, what they did was they worked with the ISPs to just notify you, said, hey, your device is infected. Here's something you can do to uninfect it. And they got a lot of compliance. They got a lot of those devices cleaned up. Something like 800,000 devices were part of that botnet. So it's really huge. But they still had 100,000 left that weren't cleaned up through these voluntary efforts. So that's part of the reason they've turned towards these, more, what I call more intrusive efforts, really complex offensive cyber operations in a way, just directed at, ordinary Americans in their home offices. Again, this seems to have worked out really, really well. It's a great success. But I talk about some of the concerns down the road with this kind of legal authority for the government to reach into our devices.
I've seen some reporting that the takedown was really only a takedown by name, and that after the U.S. government conducted this operation against Volt Typhoon, there were still bad actors operating in U.S. networks. So do we have a sense of how much of a real takedown this was?
This was not a takedown of Volt Typhoon. This was a takedown of a botnet that Volt Typhoon was using. It was called the KV botnet. And that really is the specific kind of malware that allowed the botnet to be created. It targeted Cisco and Netgear routers that were older routers, still work just fine, but they're no longer being supported by the manufacturer with updates. So they're vulnerable to this kind of attack. And by taking over that botnet, the FBI was basically able to delete the botnet. That doesn't mean Volt Typhoon is not operational still. All it means is that Volt Typhoon is no longer using this particular botnet. They may be using another botnet, or they may be using other techniques and procedures to hide their tracks as they engage in the espionage, which I would still call espionage because it's not actually launching an attack on critical infrastructure. It's preparing the groundwork for a possible attack on critical infrastructure. So that's obviously alarming, something we want to stop, but nothing really that unusual in the sense that, we call that preparation of the battlefield. And, it's the kind of thing that we would expect large nation states to be doing if they want to give themselves the capability of launching large-scale cyber attacks in the event of a conflict.
And Tim, just one follow-up here. So what was the scale of the KKV botnet in terms of its presence in U.S. networks?
So it's not clear that it was terribly large. The Justice Department statements talk about hundreds of infected routers. Like I said, other botnets have had hundreds of thousands. So that doesn't sound huge to me, but it may not be so much the size as how effective the botnet actually is. And that may, of course, be understating other kinds of techniques that the government was using to clean up the botnet. This was really just discussing the specific routers that they were targeting with this court-authorized deletion of the malware on those devices.
Paul, you argued in your piece that in light of this incident, the U.S. should rethink its cybersecurity strategy. Before we get into why you think we need this new strategy, I want to get on the table what you view as two of the fundamental tenets of the U.S. cybersecurity strategy. The first that you reference in your piece is the cyber version of mutually assured deterrence, which people will be familiar with in the nuclear weapons context. So, Paul, could you describe this concept and how it applies in the context of cybersecurity?
Well, mutually assured deterrence or mutually assured destruction, as you said, comes from the nuclear realm. It was developed in the 1950s. It was the concept that if I hold your cities at risk and you hold mine at risk, and the consequences of setting off the nuclear weapons is so catastrophic that neither of us is willing to risk that possibility, we reach a steady state of mutually assured destruction, which ensures that neither of us actually asks. Put colloquially, we won't bomb Moscow if you don't bomb New York. And that worked rather successfully with, some risky moments there, especially with respect to Cuba, for 50 years and continues to really work today. In the cyber realm, we've never really been sure that the same kind of mutually assured destruction, or what we've taken to calling mutually assured disruption, would be or is an effective strategy. We have assumed for most of our strategic purposes that it is. In other words, that if we hold at risk the electric grid in Beijing and they hold at risk the electric grid in New York, the potential consequences of turning off the lights in each city are so grave, so catastrophic that neither party will do it, much in the way that they wouldn't launch a nuclear missile. This idea that by holding others' critical infrastructure at cyber risk, we ensure greater stability has undergirded much of our response to cyber threats at a national security level for the last 15 or 20 years.
And would you say that before this incident, that it's generally been successful or not nearly as successful as in the nuclear context?
Well, it's hard to say, right? Because a lot of what happens in cyber we don't see, unlike nuclear weapons where the explosion of one is self-evident to the entire world. However, the sense that those who are observers on the outside have had is that for the last, say, 10 years, while there have been minor cyber disruptions of some bits of critical infrastructure, there has never been a significant instance in which a nation state has actively sought to disrupt and disable the critical infrastructure of a peer opponent nation state. And to the extent that appears to be factually true, and again, the facts are sometimes a little obscure, but to the extent that appears to be factually true, then one can say that, in fact, it has worked. Put another way, at least as of this moment, there have been almost no instances in which a human death has been or could reasonably be attributable to the cyber activity of another nation state. And so that seems like a successful statement about how the current strategy seems to have worked in the past few years.
So a reciprocal component that you discuss in your piece of this mutually assured disruption strategy is purely defensive measures. Could you describe where the United States' efforts along this axis have been focused?
Back when the mutually assured destruction paradigm was developed in the nuclear context, there were no defensive measures that were reasonably available. The U.S. government in the 1950s leaned into maybe the idea of like everybody building a bomb shelter, but most people understood that that was more for show than reality. That paradigm of lack of defense was significantly disrupted in the nuclear context with the development of anti-ballistic missiles. And that's one of the reasons why initially there was a treaty that prohibited the development of anti-ballistic missiles, because it was thought that good defenses would disrupt the assuredness of the mutual destruction that was at the core of stability in the nuclear realm. In the cyber context, those defenses that we have built in the past or past 10 years have not exclusively, but predominantly been focused on essentially the cyber equivalent of building bomb shelters for our critical infrastructure. That is strengthening critical infrastructure defenses, enhancing their ability through threat and intelligence sharing to defend themselves against nation-state intruders, and ultimately, possibly, disrupting this concept of mutually assured cyber disruption through the existence of a better or more perfect set of defenses against the activities of putative nation-state opponents, peer opponents like China or Russia.
Paul, even a smart cybersecurity strategy will fail sometimes. So why do you think that the Volt Typhoon incident suggests that these two components of the U.S. cyber strategy are fundamentally flawed, as you argue in your piece, rather than that they illustrate the principle that it's hard to play defense in the cyber context?
Well, to start with, they do illustrate the principle that it's hard to play defense. That hasn't changed. But what they demonstrate is twofold. The first is our assumption has been that mutually assured disruption was such a significant deterrent to escalatory cyber behavior that nobody would do it. That, as I said, the Chinese would not turn off New York because they were afraid that we would turn off Beijing or stop the water to Beijing. Volt Typhoon suggests the possibility that the Chinese no longer accept that paradigm. They have made such significant preparations for affirmative action against American infrastructure that it seems to me quite plausible that they've modified their paradigm to incorporate cyber disruptive activity as a component of their kinetic military planning, which is to say they hope that by threatening to disrupt American infrastructure, they may either deter America altogether from military activity, say defending Taiwan, or they may be in a position, they think, to impose such costs on America through the disruption of our critical infrastructure that we will withdraw our military support from Taiwan if we even begin it. So they now seem to be indicating that cyber activities, disruptive domestic cyber activities of that sort, are part of the combined operations plan for Chinese military activity more generally. If that's truly the case, if Volt Typhoon is demonstrating that change in perspective in China, that's really a sea change in what we think about what they're thinking, so to speak, which will necessarily need to be reflective in our views. The other aspect of change in our strategy is that we have focused our hardening defensive efforts almost exclusively, not almost, but substantially on the end target, the critical infrastructure providers themselves. We have done very little, both legally and practically, to assist in the defense of the routers that you and I are using, the CCTV cameras that are used as way stations to the larger attack. This vulnerability has been known for quite some time. There has been no political will to address it, and thus the only way left to address it is the way that Tim described quite accurately as a super intrusive mass hacking warrant sort of thing, which comes after the fact, after the intrusion, rather than before. And, Tim obviously thinks is inadequate for legal and social reasons. I think it is inadequate for practical reasons. And so that too needs to be rethought, as we need to examine what ways to the left of boom ex ante can we move forward in strengthening the defensive systems insofar as they are incorporated in small scale devices like routers, modems, and security cameras.
We're going to turn to some of those reforms later on. But before we get there, Tim, you had a different takeaway from the Volt Typhoon incident. You were primarily focused on the warrants that have permitted the government to conduct these cyber operations. So could you describe the current process the government must undertake to obtain the authority to conduct the kinds of responses it took when it became aware of the presence of Volt Typhoon actors?
Sure. And let me just start by backing up a minute. I was pleased to see the government take the actions it did take to disrupt the botnet. I thought they made a great deal of sense. And I kind of scratched my head and thought, court authorization. So is that some kind of injunction? Do they have like a big hearing with the judge to discuss the operation and what the risks are and what the possible consequences are? And the answer to all of those is no. It's just a standard warrant. And it's a warrant like the kind that the police would use to search an office or a single computer. And it applies to hundreds, thousands, potentially millions of devices. And so this makes me think, great, I'm glad that they're doing that to clean up malware. But the process for obtaining a warrant is a pretty cursory one. I mean, you go in front of a magistrate judge, you tell the judge, here is probable cause that a particular device or computer is, an instrumentality of crime. That means that it's being used for criminal purposes, or it contains evidence of a crime, or it's a fruit of a crime. And all of this is on the basis of a very low standard. Probable cause is, kind of a high standard by surveillance purposes, when you're thinking about different kinds of investigative techniques. But when you're thinking about remedies, it's a pretty low standard. We're not talking about the kind of standard you would use to get an injunction or in a full-blown criminal case. And of course, all of this is entirely ex parte. It's just the government presents it, the judge looks at it, in this case, a magistrate judge, and signs off on it. And that might be fine for run-of-the-mill routine searches. That's perfectly fine. That's been around for centuries. But for a very complex operation involving huge numbers of devices, it seems like pretty cursory judicial review. And the second point is there's nothing in that theory, that legal theory that the government can reach into my device or your device or millions of Americans' devices that limits it to kind of remedying malware or other kinds of things that we might welcome. Like, yeah, I'd like the government to take my device and not make it part of a Chinese-owned botnet. It could be for any criminal purpose. So, think about all of the different potential code that sits on a device or a computer that a single magistrate judge anywhere in the country might be persuaded is being used for illegal purposes. That could be cryptocurrency that's being used for money laundering or tax evasion. That could be, potentially encrypted apps that are being targeted by lawmakers in state and federal. That could be just any number of, TikTok. Government wants to ban TikTok. If it succeeds and it can make the use of TikTok on your phone a fruit or instrumentality of crime, then under this theory, you could hack into every single device with nothing more than a warrant, and not just individual warrants, but these kind of mass warrants that apply to all the devices that fit the parameters of that warrant. So that's why I call them nationwide mass hacking warrants. I think they're pretty clearly fit the definition that the framers were thinking about when they banned the concept of general warrants. But of course, this is the digital age, and so these concerns, there's not a perfect fit here. So my proposal is to replace these generalized warrants with basically a legal authority that would allow the government to go in under much fuller judicial review, get review of these operations, and get rid of this legal fiction that this has anything to do with a warrant. This has to do with remedying computers that are, it's a cybersecurity operation. It's not a law enforcement operation. And so I think that that's part of the big problem, is that we don't want to set the precedent that government can reach into millions of devices, which works really, is necessary in cybersecurity operations sometimes. We don't want to set the precedent that we can do that broadly for all sorts of other law enforcement purposes.
So, Tim, this authorization process changed quite significantly in 2016. How did it change then?
Sure. So there was a technicality involving Rule 41 of the Federal Rules of Criminal Procedure, which is the venue rule. And what this rule basically says is a judge has the authority to issue a search warrant for searches in that judge's district, which makes a good deal of sense. You don't want to have prosecutors being able to shop for every judge in the country to issue a search warrant anywhere else in the country. But this doesn't work in the case of mass hacking, because you're talking about devices located in many, many districts, perhaps potentially all over the country. And in the case of some kinds of investigations involving what are called NITs, network investigative techniques, which are used in investigations that basically target the dark web, where users are using software to hide their location, you may not know what district they're in. So the government was going and getting a single warrant in one particular district that would cover anyone all over the country. And in a series of cases involving child sexual abuse material, defendants who were facing very serious criminal charges challenged the underlying warrants, saying that these had violated Rule 41 of the Federal Rules of Criminal Procedure because they were warrants that were issued in a district other than the district that the search took place. And some of these challenges were creating headaches for the government. Typically, many of them succeeded, but it was kind of a Pyrrhic victory for the defendants because the evidence stayed in. The convictions were upheld on the idea that this was in good faith. But in any event, the government succeeded in 2016 in getting that rule changed. And in getting that rule changed so that in two circumstances, one is if you're trying to hide your location, and the other is if malware is infecting your device. In those two cases, you can get a nationwide warrant. And some civil liberties advocates said, this is really kind of setting a bad precedent here. These are kind of like general warrants, and we think that they should be narrower. Congress dismissed those concerns and went ahead with the amendment. And since that time, the government has had this broader authority, and Congress has never revisited it. And my piece basically is making the argument that Congress should revisit this because if we continue to expand Rule 41 in this way and authorize more and more nationwide hacking warrants, we may end up in a place that we don't like because we'll be giving the government broad power to search any digital device anywhere in the country if it says that the code is illegal. And there's just, you're not talking about individualized cases and individualized investigations of the kinds that the framers were thinking about. You're really talking about generalized mass hacking of Americans' computers in order to deal with whatever the flavor of the month happens to be when it comes to code that one or another Justice Department might think should be made illegal.
Tim, what is the government's theory for overcoming these Fourth Amendment concerns you say are raised by these broad warrants? And what do you think of that theory?
So that's kind of the $64,000 question in a lot of ways. No one's really going to go running up to the ramparts, flying, Gadsden flags to defend the venue provisions of Rule 41. But many of us are pretty attached to the Bill of Rights and the Fourth Amendment. The Fourth Amendment prohibits unreasonable searches and seizures and requires that warrants particularly describe the person or place to be searched or things to be seized. So, basically the argument is this. The government says, I'm particularly describing a set of digital devices that may be a very large set, and I don't know where any of them are, but this is the set of all Cisco routers and Netgear routers that have this kind of malware on them. I want to search all of them, regardless of where they're located. The government would say, well, that particularly describes those things, but there's a lot of them. And I guess my point is, this is where, I think that the digital age has, given us something that didn't exist back in, 1791. It's given us the ability to conduct with precision a seizure of digital assets based on this standard of probable cause, even though we're talking about a huge, large-scale operation. And my point is just that that's very, very different than the kind of seizures that we've typically seen before with warrants. And to me, even though I understand the argument that you're particularly describing them because you're, listing the specific kind of code that you're looking for, to me, that just crosses the line into a generalized, kind of search and seizure of the kind that the Fourth Amendment was trying to prevent and makes it unreasonable. And if we are going to authorize those kind of operations, maybe we can do it for important cybersecurity or national security purposes, but we ought to be clear that this is an exception to the warrant requirement of the Fourth Amendment that we're going to look at, like we look at other exceptions, that this is not just a standard warrant, which would then allow it to be used in any crime, no matter whether it's, compelling and all of that, or whether it's just run-of-the-mill crime. And that's where I think the danger is.
Paul, what do you think of the government's Fourth Amendment argument for these warrants?
Well, I agree with Tim that it's a very expansive theory. As he was listing the things that they could go after next, I thought that the obvious next step would be an intrusion to remove child sexual abuse material, which is both rampant and everywhere and horrific, but the extirpation of which might cause problems for other cherished rights. My only real answer to Tim at this point is the same one that kind of Donald Rumsfeld used in Iraq. You go to war with the army you have, not the army you wish you had. You go to cyber security conflict with the laws and regulations in place, not with the ones you wish you had. If I thought that there was a reasonable prospect for the development of a congressional consensus that would amend and modify Rule 41 in the ways that Tim suggests are necessary, I think I'd probably be mostly supportive of it. My problem is I think that the chances of that happening are really quite slim at this point. And so for my money, the revisions to Rule 41 that Tim suggests are best wrapped up in broader revisions about, how we do threat intelligence analysis for routers and modems, how we incentivize protections for them so that we don't need to intrude on them afterwards, what sorts of notification procedures we might engage in. It's an unfortunate and horrible conundrum, and in some ways, where Tim is exactly the product of our strategic blind spot over the last several years, and we're making do with what we have.
So, Paul, you write in your piece that you think the legislative and regulatory picture is pretty bleak. So, what are the best steps you think the government can take in the near future to improve our cybersecurity strategy that you say is flawed?
Well, the first, which we can handle at kind of the national security level, is to reevaluate whether or not the current strategy of disruption still holds. That would involve, from my perspective, things like trying to discern whether or not there has been an actual change in Chinese strategy. That may involve intelligence collection of a human or a SIGINT variety. That sort of assessment is precisely what we pay the intelligence communities to do. And I would be tasking them with conducting that assessment right away. Were they to come back with a determination that, in fact, the Chinese now see cyber disruption as a component of a combined military operation that they would deploy in time of conflict, say, over Taiwan, then that would next require us to figure out what our responsive strategy might be. It might be to increase the threats to Chinese infrastructure, reciprocally in the hopes of deterring them. It might be finding something else that the Chinese value more highly than their infrastructure, because they may think that they're differentially less dependent on infrastructure, and so they're willing to suffer the consequences. So we'd have to identify something else that they value more highly, perhaps. And this is just speculation on my part, but things like their information security and their monopoly on information coming into the country, which undergirds a lot of their authoritarian hegemony. That might be something we could hold at risk. I confess I don't know the answers to that. What I do know is that as a matter of external strategy, we need to evaluate whether or not we need to change it, and then engage in the process with the culture of Chinese experts that pervade, Department of State, Department of Defense, the intelligence community, and ask them what the best possible response might be. On the domestic side, I'm afraid that we are out of luck unless and until we develop the political will to increase incentives, if not regulatory demands, on the security of small devices. I genuinely don't see that happening very much, and I don't see a lot of regulatory room in existing laws and regulations for the executive branch to do that unilaterally. The president's cybersecurity policy from last year more or less admitted as much when it said it needed to work with Congress to develop new regulations for cybersecurity. So there, I would be gathering more information to exemplify the problem more readily, and then doing the best I could to convince a divided Congress that it needs to act on this particular issue in a bipartisan manner.
What role does private industry have here? It seems that, we saw last May that Microsoft was the entity that identified the presence of Volt Typhoon in U.S. networks. So how can government work more effectively with private industry to bolster our systems?
Well, that is the $64,000 question, isn't it? We've been harping on public-private partnerships for 20 years now. And don't get me wrong, there have been successes in that regard. Though I think it's incomplete, nobody would disagree that the electric grid as currently structured is much safer than it was 15 years ago. Same for the financial networks. They've really ramped up their cybersecurity to a large degree because of cooperative efforts with the U.S. government. I would say that we've done almost none of that with respect to smaller devices and with respect to small businesses and individuals, much less. And so that would be a focus of effort, a focus of the investment of resources, time and money. It's much more unwieldy problem. If you talk about the electric grid, you can identify almost everybody who's a major player and talk to them all directly through the Information Sharing and Advisory Committees, the ISACs. You just can't do that with respect to routers and modems unless you begin really imposing consequences on the manufacturers and requiring them to change their behavior, which I'm not sure is regulatorily possible or politically possible.
Tim, you lay out a series of legislative principles that should be part of any law that addresses the issues we've been discussing today. Could you describe some of those principles?
I will, but first I just wanted to respond to a couple of things that Paul said, if that's okay.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. So the first thing is that Paul says, well, I don't think Congress is going to enact these. I really think that I agree that Congress isn't just going to do something because it's a good idea. It would be lovely if they did. But that's part of the reason that I felt that it was important to make a strong legal challenge to the existing way in which these mass hacking warrants have been used. And to make that legal challenge under the Fourth Amendment and not just under Rule 41, which of course has been amended. If a court struck these down and said these are not reasonable search warrants, they don't have particularity, we're not going to allow them as the underlying legal authority for botnet takedowns or for going after, other kinds of criminals that might be trying to hide their location on the internet, then it would put the ball in Congress's court to provide an alternative. And then I do think that Justice Department and Congress will work together to try to provide that alternative. The second point I wanted to respond to is that I agree that the focus on critical infrastructure has been far too narrow if you're trying to respond to China or any other adversary's potential attacks, cyber attacks, because cyber problems happen because of software and devices that are not regulated, that are not part of the critical infrastructure sectors. The problem with the Typhoon's botnet, the KV botnet, was older Cisco and Netgear routers. Who's responsible for that? Well, obviously, Cisco and Netgear are responsible. They made a business decision not to devote resources to updating those routers, leaving them vulnerable. So that's an incentive problem. It wasn't the fault of critical infrastructure sectors. It wasn't the fault of ordinary Americans. It was the fault of those two companies. And one of the things that President Biden's strategy talks about, and again, it can't do this on its own, but it talks about the use of liability, right? I mean, we should shift the cost of cleaning up this botnet, which has been taken on by the FBI using these very intrusive mass hacking warrants, to the companies and say, hey, I know these are older devices. You got to still pay for some software folks to update them, or you have to have some, process for getting them out of people's homes. You can't just leave them out there. They're a danger. And then the third thing I wanted to respond to is, the idea that this Volt Typhoon operation kind of shows that mutually assured disruption as a strategy doesn't work. I agree 100% with that. I don't think it ever particularly worked. And I think part of the reason for that is that the whole analogy is wrong. Cyber attacks, even large-scale cyber attacks on critical infrastructure, are nothing at all like nuclear weapons. They're almost the opposite of nuclear weapons. And this analogy, I think, has been very harmful to discussions about cyber strategy. Nuclear weapons pose unique problems because their use is unimaginable, because of the scale of the destruction being so much greater than that of any other traditional weapon. The problem with cyber weapons is that they're too imaginable. They're not only imaginable, they're easy, because you can imagine a cyber option as being something that is less likely to provoke a massive military response than a conventional option. And so I don't think that our threats to launch a huge cyber attack on China, if they launch one on us, are particularly credible. I think that for one, just for one reason, the law of war doesn't permit attacks on civilian infrastructure. And so it's not clear to me that we would even have that available to us under the law of war. But also, China may make the calculation that they can withstand such an attack because it's an authoritarian country. Whereas, if we have serious problems, in terms of our cyber grid, the public will just get fed up and decide, yeah, we don't really care that much about Taiwan. We want our lights back on, please. And that may be a perfectly reasonable assumption. Whereas China would be far more hesitant to launch a conventional attack on the United States, let alone a nuclear attack. So I just think that those kind of analogies can sometimes hurt us more than they help us. Now again, you asked me about my proposal, and my basic legislative proposal would be, based on a few principles. The first is that we would want to authorize specific kinds of cybersecurity remediation operations, right? So that means the targets are devices that have been hijacked from innocent owners. Operation will not interfere with legitimate functions of the devices and doesn't seek and doesn't copy or acquire other code or data. These are limits that are not, part of ordinary search warrants. The government might impose them on their operations, but there's nothing in the law that requires that. So I would put that in the law. I would not include in a law that's about cybersecurity mitigation anything involving criminal investigation. So that, if we're going to talk about mass hacking that's used for criminal purposes, criminal investigative purposes, we should think about that in another statute. That has a lot of other implications that I would want to address separately. I think there should be technical review of these mitigation operations. Courts could seek technical advice, independent technical advice on what the downsides might be. They shouldn't have to rely entirely on the government's own assessments, which is what they have to do now. And then courts should be empowered to impose minimization or other kinds of protections on operations. They wouldn't have that authority under an ordinary search warrant. They would have that under, typical surveillance statutes, because those are statutes. So I think they should have that explicit authority. And there should be detailed audits, reporting, and oversight, again, of the kind that we have in surveillance statutes, which is not the case for typical search warrants, which are really not designed for these kind of operations.
Paul, do you want to respond to a couple of Tim's points that he made?
Sure. I'm happy to talk about deterrence theory. The first and most obvious point is that none of this is ineluctable or absolutely certain. And so when we are disagreeing about the impact of potential disruption or deterrence theory, both Tim and I are kind of making predictive judgments. Mine, is that at least since the strategy of conflict was written, we've understood by Thomas Schelling, we've understood that deterrence is not about the usability of a weapon, but rather about the unthinkability of the consequences. And in cyber, unlike in nuclear weapons, Tim is right that some consequences are eminently thinkable. We've had lots of examples of ransomware and disruptions that are thinkable. The thing that I disagree with Tim about is that for the last several years, the tenet of American strategy that we believe the Chinese have agreed upon is that there was a line out there somewhere that involved large-scale, massive cyber critical infrastructure disruptions that was unthinkable. And it's why we haven't seen a massive takedown of the global financial network, for example. Well, that's eminently possible at this point if one were to undertake to do it. So for me, it's much more a question of gradation. And I do think that the Chinese activity, as indicated by the assessment of the U.S. intelligence agencies, seems to reflect a change of their perception such that these results, these consequences that we previously thought of as unthinkable, are now becoming for them thinkable. And Tim's right. It may be because they consider themselves to be an authoritarian nation that can withstand the pain more readily than a democratic nation like America. It may be that they developed a super secret defensive weapon that we're completely unaware of that makes them think that the threat no longer exists to their critical infrastructure. I just don't know the answer to that. I can only see the emanations of the potential change in that theory and what they've done. The only other couple of points that I would make in brief response are, yes, you can't deliberately target civilian infrastructure under the laws of armed conflict, but it's absolutely clear that things like the electric grid are dual use infrastructure, and they're targeted all the time, both in times of war and, in times of war. So if the U.S. were to come to the defense of Taiwan physically, and American and Chinese troops were at war with each other there, it seems to me pretty clear that we could target their critical infrastructure as supportive of the war effort, just as they might likewise do ours. The assumption had been that we would not, that the domestic home fronts would be off limits, but the Chinese may be thinking otherwise. And then the last bit I would say is that, to the extent that international law bears on this at all, there is a sense in which the Chinese have already violated that law. The U.S. versus Nicaragua case, in which, to be clear, the U.S. did not participate, was an ICJ decision holding that the mining of the Nicaraguan harbors without blowing up the mines was itself an act of war. And many people have thought to analogize that case to the planting of malware that may be triggered in times of conflict as likewise being in violation of international law, sovereignty obligations. How much influence and power one gives to international law is a completely different podcast that you can have. I am in the not much category because I don't see it as having a lot of effective enforcement mechanisms. But there you go. So all of which is a way of saying I'm not 100% sure I know where this is going to go, but I do think I know that Volt Typhoon is something different from the Chinese.
Tim, would you like the last word here?
Sure. I mean, I think maybe we've narrowed any disagreement we've had there, because I guess my only point is that, of course, Beijing didn't want to and still doesn't want to launch a large-scale cyber attack, and it may be wanting to prepare to have that option. But my only point was there was a kind of a basic flaw in the whole concept of, mutually assured disruption, or the nuclear weapons analogy, which is that, it's just a different order of decision, right? The government of China has nuclear weapons too, right? That kind of does have a deterrent effect on U.S.-Chinese, conflict, is that we're both nuclear armed nations. The fact that we're both cyber armed nations, I think, is totally different, right? It's far more likely that we may cross that line than that we will use conventional weapons against each other. That's my only basic point. And I think Paul and I agree on that. The reason China hasn't used them so far is because it's not in their interest, because we may have all sorts of problems with China. We may, be facing all sorts of potential conflicts in the future, but it's a long and complex relationship. And there are, lots of good reasons why the Chinese wouldn't want to, launch those kinds of attacks. And obviously reasons why we wouldn't want to either. So my only argument there was that this whole concept was somewhat flawed. And now we're seeing that flaw, I think, in exactly what Paul was saying in his piece, which is that, if this strategy ever made any sense, it certainly doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense now.
All right. We will have to leave it there. Thank you both for joining us on the Lawfare podcast.
Thank you. And it's been lovely to be here and great talking with my good friend, Paul.
And likewise, always a grand pleasure to hear my good friend, Tim.
The Lawfare podcast is produced in cooperation with the Brookings Institution. You can get ad-free versions of this and other Lawfare podcasts by becoming a Lawfare material supporter through our website, lawfaremedia.org/support. You'll also get access to special events and other content available only to our supporters. Please rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts. Look out for our other podcasts, including Rational Security, Chatter, Allies, and The Aftermath, our latest Lawfare Presents podcast series on the government's response to January 6th. Check out our written work at lawfaremedia.org. The podcast is edited by Jen Patja, and your audio engineer this episode was Kara Schillen of Goat Rodeo. Our music is performed by Sophia Yan. As always, thanks for listening.